Okay, let's really dig into something fascinating today. We've got these incredible stories. Priya in India, right? She's not just continuing her family's silk weaving legacy.
Which is amazing in itself.
Totally. But she's also using her YouTube channel to, like, fund girls' literacy in her village.
Wow.
And then you've got Maria in Guatemala. She's a Mayan weaver, keeping these ancient techniques alive. But she sells her work online to fund reforestation, led by women in her community.
Yeah, and on the surface, it looks like a contradiction, doesn't it? You know, tradition versus progress, or modern empowerment.
Exactly. It feels like a tug of war. But these stories, they kind of blur those lines.
They really do, and that's what immediately grabs you, that apparent contrast, and how it's maybe not so contrasting after all. It's less about opposition, I think, and more about a dynamic interplay.
Right.
So our focus today, our deep dive, is right into that intersection. How are women, globally actively reimagining their cultural heritage through what we might call a feminist lens?
And we've pulled together quite a bit. Research studies, case studies, lots of examples from all over.
Yeah, the mission is really to unpack how these two seemingly disparate forces actually meet and what surprising insights kind of pop up.
Absolutely. Because the easy assumption, I guess, is that feminism just arrives and sweeps tradition away.
Right, the bulldozer model.
Yeah. But the reality we're seeing is just so much richer, more inventive than that. So let's maybe kick things off by challenging that whole idea that tradition is just this fixed, unchanging thing from the past.
That's such a fundamental starting point because traditions are living things. They evolve, they're constantly being shaped and reshaped. And it's actually really revealing if you look back at how early feminist movements strategically worked within existing cultural ideas to push for change.
Oh, interesting. Like how?
Well, think about the suffragettes. A lot of their arguments for the vote weren't just about rights. They were framed as a kind of moral imperative.
Wow.
Yeah, like it was women's duty, building on their perceived role as society's moral compass, They use those existing social norms.
To argue for something pretty radical, politically speaking.
Exactly. Leveraging the framework to shift the power dynamic.
That's clever. And wasn't there someone even earlier, like Mary Wollstonecraft?
Yes.
Yeah.
Late 18th century. When she argued for women's education, which was radical, then she often framed it by saying educated women would be better wives and mothers.
Using the existing roles to argue for something that ultimately expands those roles.
Precisely. She used the prevailing understanding as her launchpad to challenge the very limitations of those roles.
Okay.
Now, fast forward quite a bit to the Arab Spring. You had figures like Tawakkul Karman in Yemen. She used the traditional veil.
Which is often seen, maybe from the outside, as purely traditional or even oppressive.
Right. But she used it as a potent symbol, a symbol of her identity, her culture, and her right to be out there protesting for democracy. It sent a really powerful message.
Like, we are rooted here and we demand change.
Exactly that. This is who I am, and this is what I fight for.
That image really sticks with you. And it's not just history, right?
Yeah.
There was that big Pew Research study a few years back.
Yeah, 2020. Really comprehensive. It found that globally, 65% of women, a significant majority, believe feminism actually complements their cultural values.
Wow, 65%.
Yeah, but with a key condition. When feminism is framed as working towards equality within community contexts.
So not tearing down the community, but improving things within it.
Precisely. It suggests that for most women, feminism isn't about ditching their cultural identity. It's about finding ways to participate more equitably, to be recognized within that identity, strengthening the community, not fracturing it.
Okay, so that naturally leads us to question this sort of monolithic idea we sometimes have of the traditional woman.
Right, because what picture pops into your head when you hear that? Often it's quite narrow, isn't it? And frankly, often a very westernized, maybe even Eurocentric image. But if you actually look across history, across different cultures, the reality is so much broader. Take the Haudenosaunee, for example, the Iroquois Confederacy.
Okay, what was their structure like?
Well, what's really striking is that before European contact, Haudenosaunee women held significant power, real power.
How so?
They were the clan mothers. They controlled property, agriculture, lineage. They were absolutely central to political decision-making. Their society was, in many ways, much more egalitarian than what the European colonizers brought over.
And those colonizers actively tried to change that system.
Oh, absolutely. Colonial powers worked pretty systematically to dismantle those indigenous systems and impose their own patriarchal structures. It forces you to ask, what do we even mean by traditional, and whose traditions got imposed or erased?
It completely reframes the whole narrative. And you see echoes of that reclaiming spirit today, right? With figures like Katsi Cook.
Yes, Katsi Cook, a Mohawk midwife. She's doing this incredible work, not just reviving traditional indigenous birthing practices, which is vital work in itself, but she's also a fierce advocate for modern reproductive rights. It's this really powerful weaving together of, ancestral knowledge and very contemporary feminist concerns.
Heritage and advocacy, hand in hand.
Precisely. And tradition isn't just one story. Look at Rwanda, post-genocide. An incredibly difficult context.
Unimaginably so.
But they've made these remarkable strides in feminist policymaking. Women now hold the highest percentage of parliamentary seats globally, something like 61%.
That's astounding.
It is. And at the same time, there's been this huge emphasis on cultural revival. Preserving traditions like Migongo art, this intricate geometric painting style traditionally done by women.
So political progress and cultural preservation happening together.
Exactly. As Donatil Mukabalisa, a prominent figure there, put it, their grandmothers used these patterns to tell stories of resilience. And now, women are using, the same hands, the same spirit to shape the nation's laws. It shows how deeply intertwined these things can be, especially in rebuilding a society.
That's an incredibly powerful image. And it's not just within single nations, is it? The Kurdish women's movement seems to be redefining tradition in a really fundamental way.
Oh, absolutely. What they're doing is deeply transformative. They are integrating gender equality right into the core of their struggle for cultural autonomy across regions like Syria and Turkey.
We hear about the YPJ, the Women's Protection Units.
Yes, who are vital in fighting ISIS. But it goes beyond the military aspect. They've also established women's councils focused on reviving Kurdish language, folklore, culture.
There's a political and a cultural struggle.
Completely intertwined. Their commander, Nesrin Abdullah, basically said their revolution is feminist because their culture is feminist. For them, you can't separate the fight for cultural identity from the fight for gender equality.
Wow. And then there's this interesting case in Scandinavia, the Nordic paradox, involving Sami women.
Yeah, it's a fascinating wrinkle because while Nordic countries are often seen as global leaders in gender equality,
Right, top of the rankings usually.
the Sami people, the indigenous group there, have faced a lot of historical pressure, forced assimilation. Now you have Sami women actively reclaiming practices like reindeer herding.
Which is central to their culture.
Absolutely central.
Okay.
And it was a tradition they were at risk of being excluded from or losing. Eleanor Marita Yoma, one of the voices in this movement, makes it clear. Feminism for them isn't about rejecting their Sami heritage. It's about demanding the right to fully participate in it, to define it on their own terms.
So even within supposedly egalitarian societies, there are these specific cultural contexts where feminism takes on a unique role.
Exactly. It highlights the need for really nuanced approaches. It's not one size fits all.
So, okay, instead of feminism being this wrecking ball to tradition, it seems like in many cases it's actually acting more like cultural stewardship, breathing new life into heritage, but with a feminist perspective.
That's a great way to put it, cultural stewardship. Think about Japan's womenomics policies trying to get more women into the workforce.
Right.
That hasn't meant they've abandoned omotenashi, that deep cultural value of selfless hospitality. The two coexist. Economic empowerment doesn't automatically erase cultural values.
Okay.
Or look at Nigeria's Nollywood film industry. It's huge, vibrant, and you often see these stories celebrating female entrepreneurs, but they're operating within, traditional communal family structures.
Showing women being both modern and connected to heritage.
Exactly. And the Zapatista women in Mexico, another powerful example. They're on the front lines fighting for land rights, political representation.
Serious political struggle.
While also fiercely safeguarding their indigenous languages, their incredible weaving traditions. Mariana Gomez says something beautiful like, when we wear our huipil's traditional blouses, we carry the dreams of our ancestors. It's tangible.
Wow. The past literally woven into the present fight.
It truly is. And education is key here, too. In Bhutan, there's this really interesting program training women in traditional thangka painting, that intricate Buddhist art. But significantly, they also weave feminist history into the curriculum. Daichen Wangmo, an instructor, said these women aren't just learning art, They're becoming custodians of history, keeping vital stories alive through their craft.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
And this isn't just like feel-good anecdotes, is it? There's data backing this up.
There is. A 2023 World Bank report actually found a correlation. Countries with more progressive gender policies tend to have higher rates of cultural preservation.
Interesting. So empowering women might actually help keep traditions alive.
It suggests that, yeah. Which makes sense if you think about it. Who often carries and transmits cultural practices day to day? Very often it's women.
Sure.
So when women have more agency, more resources, they're better positioned to ensure those traditions continue. But of course, we absolutely have to acknowledge not all traditions are positive.
Absolutely not. And this is where feminism plays a different, but maybe even more critical role. We have to talk about practices that actively harm women and girls.
Deeply rooted practices. Things like child marriage, FGM, female genital mutilation, so-called honor killings, really serious harms.
Yeah.
And what's crucial here, I think, is that the pushback often isn't coming from outside forces trying to impose change. It's frequently local activists, very often women within those cultures, using feminist principles to challenge these practices from the inside.
Okay, so internal change agents.
Exactly. Look at Tostin in Senegal. They've had remarkable success reducing FGM. How? Through community-led dialogues. They engage elders, religious leaders, everyone, talking about health, human rights, the actual consequences.
Rather than just condemning it from afar.
Precisely. It's about facilitating understanding within their own value system. Aissatou Diop, who went through their program, said they weren't abandoning their core values. They felt they were deepening their understanding of them by choosing health and rights.
That's a really powerful distinction. Evolving values, not erasing them. What about other examples?
Well, in Bangladesh, where child marriage is still a huge issue, activists like Fatima Akhtar are using things like traditional folk theater. It's called jatra.
Using a traditional art form.
To spark conversations. They retell old myths and legends, but they deliberately highlight female strength, resilience. They reframe the tradition by focusing on powerful female figures already present in their culture. Fatima points out, these heroines are already in our stories. We just need to lift them up.
Fighting the feminist thread within the existing tapestry.
Exactly. And in Kenya, there's the Cut the Cord campaign. It's led by Maasai women against FGM. They use traditional song and dance, incredibly important cultural forms for them, to raise awareness and drive change within their own communities. Nice and Ailante Lenjet described it as singing the melodies of their grandmothers, but changing the lyrics for a new reality.
Wow. Using the culture's own tools to transform it.
It really shows that change can come from within, using the language and forms people already understand and value.
Okay. Now, another area where you often hear about conflict is faith. Religion and feminism often positioned as opposites.
That's definitely a common perception. But again, when you look closer, the picture is, much more complex and dynamic. Women across so many different faith traditions are actively showing how their religious beliefs and feminist principles can work together.
Such as?
Look, take Islamic feminism. You have scholars like Dr. Amina Wadud reinterpreting the Quran through a lens of gender justice. And in places like Indonesia, you have many women leading Islamic boarding schools, pesantren, that explicitly integrate feminist theology.
So working within the faith tradition itself.
Absolutely. And it's not just Islam. Look at Jewish feminism. It's led to huge changes. People like Sarah Hurwitz co-founded Yeshivat Maharat, the first institution to ordain Orthodox women as clergy.
That's a major shift in orthodoxy.
Huge.
Right.
And her view is that tradition isn't this rigid box. It's an ongoing conversation across generations, and it can evolve.
Yeah.
Then you have Hindu feminists re-examining ancient texts, challenging oppressive interpretations through groups like the Vedika Collective, and Buddhist feminists like Venerable Dhammananda Bhikkhuni in Thailand, fighting to revive the ordination of female monks.
So it's happening across the board.
It really seems to be. And interestingly, that Georgetown University study from 2022 found that 78%, nearly 4 out of 5 religious women globally, see feminism as compatible with their spiritual practice.
78%. That really counters the narrative of inherent conflict.
It really does. For a huge majority, it seems faith and feminism aren't mutually exclusive. They can actually reinforce each other.
And it's important, I think, to say this isn't just about women reshaping tradition, right? Men have a role, too.
Oh, absolutely crucial. This conversation has to include how men are redefining masculinity within their traditional contexts.
How does that look?
Well, in South Africa, there's the Sunk Gender Justice Initiative. They work directly with male elders, community leaders, and they use traditional concepts like Zulu proverbs emphasizing community responsibility.
using the culture's own wisdom.
To challenge patriarchal norms and violence. Bafana Kumalo from Sonke often talks about Ubuntu, I am because we are, to frame gender equality as part of collective well-being.
That's powerful, connecting it to core cultural values.
Exactly. And even somewhere like Iceland, you think Vikings, right? Often very hyper-masculine sagas.
Right.
But you have fathers groups like Dagsini Reykjavik using those same sagas to promote shared parenting. They highlight the stories, maybe less told, of male figures who are also nurturing, involved fathers. John Sigurðsson, the founder, talks about finding those alternative narratives within the tradition.
Finding different facets of masculinity that were maybe always there.
Precisely, identifying and amplifying the parts of tradition that support equality. And technology and art are really becoming huge plays in this too, bridging tradition and modernity.
We're seeing some amazing examples like the hashtag Women Life Freedom protests in Iran. People were dancing to traditional Kurdish music, using a cultural form as an act of defiance.
Yeah, incredibly powerful. Or think about the Bolivian Cholita skateboarder.
Oh yeah, they're amazing.
Right, reclaiming their vibrant traditional indigenous clothing in these very modern urban spaces like skate parks. It's a seamless blend.
Tradition meets contemporary subculture.
Exactly. And technology is opening new doors. Look at Haifa al-Mansour, the Saudi filmmaker.
Watched that. Right. Great film.
Yeah. Her films often critique patriarchal structures, but she also weaves in celebrations of things like Bedouin poetry. She sees it all as part of her culture, the critique, and the celebration.
Not needing to choose between them.
Right. And then in Ghana, there's this app called Tradigital. It uses VR virtual reality to teach traditional kente weaving.
Wow, VR weaving.
Yeah. And the profits go to support girls' STEM education. Alpha Mensa, the creator, talks about it as this intersection where tradition literally meets the future, and it's being led by women.
That's incredible. Ensuring these skills don't just survive, but thrive in new ways. And this brings us to economics too, doesn't it? Women's roles in traditional industries.
Yes, a really crucial link, because women often make up the majority of the workforce in sectors like textiles, crafts, sometimes specific types of agriculture. And what's really interesting is how they tend to reinvest the money they earn. Think about the argan oil cooperatives in Morocco.
Run by Berber women. Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They've gained significant economic empowerment, which is huge. But they're also playing a vital role in protecting the agar forests, which are absolutely central to their cultural heritage and the ecosystem. Zubi Sharuf, one of the founders, said something like, "The trees are like our mothers. There's a deep connection."
Economic success tied directly to cultural environmental preservation.
Yes. And in India, you have SIWA, the Self-Employed Women's Association. It's massive, millions of members. They blend Gandhian principles with feminist economics, reviving traditional crafts like block printing, giving women real economic independence.
And there's evidence about that reinvestment you mentioned.
Yeah, a 2023 ILO International Labor Organization report showed women in these traditional industries tend to reinvest a much higher percentage of their income back into their families and communities compared to men, something like 90% versus 40%.
Wow, that's a huge difference.
It is. It means that money goes directly into education, healthcare, things that strengthen the whole community and help ensure cultural continuity.
So empowering women economically through these traditional skills can actually be a powerful engine for cultural preservation.
It really can be. And we're even seeing some legislative attempts to kind of formalize this link to bridge heritage and equality in law.
Like what? Any examples?
Well, New Zealand's Matariki Act from 2023 is interesting. It recognizes the Maori Lunar New Year as a national public holiday.
Okay.
Which is significant in itself, but it also implicitly acknowledges and elevates the role of Indigenous women as the traditional keepers of that astronomical and cultural knowledge.
Right. Valuing their specific cultural contribution.
Exactly. And maybe Colombia's 2022 care economy law. It tries to assign economic value to unpaid domestic labor, cooking, cleaning, childcare work that's often disproportionately done by women, especially within more traditional gender roles.
So making the invisible visible and giving it value.
Kind of, yeah. Trying to formally recognize work that's essential but historically undervalued. Of course, we should also say this whole process, this weaving together of feminism and tradition, it's not always smooth sailing.
No, definitely not. There must be pushback.
Absolutely. There's resistance, sometimes fierce backlash. Look at Poland, for example. You have conservative groups strongly pushing back against things like abortion rights, framing it as a defense of traditional family values.
Using tradition as a shield against feminist demands.
Exactly. But then you see the response from activists. Marta Lempart from the All Poland Women's Strike has talked about how they counter this. They invoke Polish history, legends of warrior queens, strong female figures from their own national narrative.
Fighting tradition with tradition, in a way.
Kinda. Arguing that they aren't dismantling tradition, but actually fulfilling its promise of strong, independent women. It's a fascinating dynamic.
It really is. So if we try to pull this all together, the main takeaway from this deep dive seems to be, well, that feminism and tradition aren't these mutually exclusive enemies.
Not at all.
Yeah.
They can coexist, they interact, they influence each other, sometimes in really profound ways, and often they actually enrich one another.
We started with Priya and Maria, didn't we? The Weaver funding literacy, the Weaver funding reforestation. Their stories really capture that dynamic interplay beautifully.
They really do. It boils down to seeing culture not as some fixed monument, but as something living, breathing, constantly being made and remade by the people within it.
Right.
And that reminds me of that great quote from Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. Culture does not make people. People make culture.
Oh, that's perfect.
It is, isn't it? And it leads you to a pretty fundamental question, I think. Can any tradition really thrive? Can it truly be whole if the voices, the experiences, the dreams of half its members aren't fully and equally part of its story?
That's a really powerful question to sit with. So for you, our listener, maybe that's the thought to ponder. What might our own ancestors have envisioned for us? And how can we best honor their legacy? Maybe it's not just by sticking rigidly to the past, but by embracing a future where those threads of tradition are woven together with a really strong, vibrant vision of equality for everyone.
Yeah. Dreaming bigger, perhaps, while still honoring the roots?
Exactly. Something to think about, definitely. Exploring your own relationship with heritage and progress.